Yep, thank you. My presentation will be mainly talking about two issues, two simple messages that I want to convey. First of all, when we talk about education for refugee children, often in the air is the word crisis, crisis in schools, crisis in departments of education. But what I want to show is that there is no crisis, refugee crisis, but there is a crisis how we implement policies and how we deal in our school systems with refugee children, incorporating them. Secondly, important in the discussion, especially in Europe, is this idea that refugees are maybe even better protected, better cared for in the neighboring countries. And that's why the Turkey deal between the EU and Turkey was made and sold to the European public. But what are the consequences of these policies in reality? And I will show some of these consequences in a project we are now doing in Lebanon and Turkey and Australia among Syrian refugee children. So let me start with the first point. And that we looked in a number of countries what is happening in terms of incorporating refugee children into education. We did this with local researchers because most of the research and the reports are usually in the national language, in Turkish, in Arabic, in Greek, or Swedish. So that's the only way to get a good overview what is happening in these countries. So it's based on a literature study in these countries to see what works and what is sort of damaging refugee children in education. So education, as we all know, in compulsory age is considered a human right for refugee children. But how education is organized for these children is a national responsibility. So there's a lot of variation how this is done. And that's also opening up the opportunity to see what is happening in each of these countries and what is working. So what are the components for success? And I will just briefly go into some of these. Integration into regular school system, in regular classes, or separating out children in separate classes, in separate schools. Initial or continued second language support. Education aimed only at compulsory age school children or beyond, and using community resources or ignoring them. So separated, we have a number of cases where separation was done of refugee children. In Germany and Netherlands, we separate children out for 1 or 2 years to first learn the national language, and then we eventually prepare them to go into regular classes. In Lebanon, here I already mentioned them, they are in afternoon classes, and Turkey up till 2070, they were in temporary education centers. Often when this separation is sold to the public, they mention what is good for these refugee children. But hardly this is actually the reason why they are separated out. In Germany and Netherlands, the real reason is that authorities, schools, didn't want these children in regular classes, in regular schools. It's a political issue. It's not in the interests of these children. Simply think of the idea that you need to learn Dutch or German. How do you learn this language? You learn this language being in class with kids that speak German and Dutch, and not to separate them out for 1 or 2 years. And then afterwards, of course, they go into the regular classes, but not with any sustained second language support. So they fail. In Turkey, the idea was they go back to Syria within a short period of time. So they followed the Syrian curriculum in Arabic, And all these kids now are transferring to Turkish schools, but they didn't have any command in Turkish. So there's no interest for these kids in these. These are political decisions. It can be done differently. In Sweden, children at the most are in separate classes for 3 months. But then afterwards they are in regular classes, they get sustained second language support, and this makes them also successful in school. In Turkey, in other countries in Europe, you see now a sort of mixed method where children are partly in regular classes and get second language support from an early start onwards, and also these initiatives look to be successful. So there's no educational need to separate children. The result is that children feel marginalized, they feel that they are not belonging actually to the society, they want to be normal children like other children, but actually what they feel is that there are not normal children. And this is the first step to become safe and feel as a child again in society. I talked already a bit about this issue of second language support only in welcome classes in Germany and the Netherlands. And usually if they go to regular classes, the selection points also comes to either go to vocational or academic tracks, and usually in the Netherlands and in Germany this means they go to the lowest vocational tracks regardless of their cognitive skills. And often then they end up in classes with children who have severe learning problems or behavioral problems. In Lebanon, hardly any second language support. This maybe comes to you as a surprise because they all speak Arabic, you maybe think. But they have subjects they teach in either English or French, and they don't do that in Syria, but they haven't really built up second language support for these subjects. So these kids fail in these subjects, and as a result, hardly any of them enter into upper secondary education because these are core subjects like math and science, for instance. So in Sweden you have continued second language support up until the end of secondary school, and you actually can do exams in Swedish as a second language, and that will be counted in the same way to continue into university as Swedish as a first language. So this is the way to do it. And we see a high transfer to both post-secondary education and university. In Turkey, it has to be said, now there is a massive investment in second language support in regular classes, much more than in European countries normally. So I'm not a big fan of Erdogan, but they are doing a great job in that respect. Compulsory school age. This is a very problematic issue because a lot of the children that arrive, say at age 15 or 16, and don't have a diploma already at age 17 or 18 when compulsory school ends. They cannot continue education anymore and leave school without diploma. This is happening in a lot of countries, my own country included, and it has a disastrous effect on these children. Unemployment, marginalization for this group, really, you could call them a lost generation. In Germany, they have picked up this issue, partly also because of economic reasons. They've set up a huge program on apprenticeship tracks for these children, also after the age of 18 till the age of 24, and that really helped them to enter into the labor market and to also gain still expertise to be functional on that labor market. Another big issue in most of the European countries, like in my country, in Germany, a lot of the people that came to our countries were university students, were teachers in their home country, but we refused to take them as a valuable resource in really incorporating Syrian children in our education and systems. As a result, you see that teachers, Syrian teachers now are employed in other sectors or are devaluated in a way. They work with the McDonald's. I really know examples like this. Well, they could, of course, be very valuable in terms of incorporating Syrian refugee children in our schools. In Turkey, Syrian teachers were seen as a valuable resource. In these temporary education centers, they were the teachers for the children, but now we see also an effect that they also start, now the shift has come from temporary education centers into regular classes, and you see that many of these teachers are now involved in NGO projects, also helping children, parents and schools navigate the system. So because they were not devaluated, they are still working as professionals and helping out Syrian refugee children. In Jordan, I've also seen this in the camps. You see that they make use of young Syrian children and youngsters to be employed in informal education, and many now aspire to become teachers. And so it's the most dire circumstances, and there they really trusted these children and found it valuable to make use of these resources, while we in Western European countries are devaluating these people. So we know actually what works. It's not a crisis. We need to integrate into regular classes. It can be done. Sweden, as an example, shows this. It needs continuous language support, of course. We need to provide alternative educational pathways after compulsory school, and we need to use the resources from the community. Now briefly I will talk in the second part about a new study that we are doing in Turkey, in Lebanon and Australia. Basically it is a longitudinal study where we follow Syrian refugee children in schools, what is happening with them in terms of both their school success but also their well-being and their psychological support and well-being. So this is the study, and especially I will talk a bit about the Syrian refugee children in the study and what are the outcomes for them in the situation of Lebanon and Turkey. So these are these countries, the neighboring countries, that are supposed to be a solution in terms of Europe in incorporating these children in schools. So basically I will show a few figures about missing school years, refugee families being pushed around in the country, education competing with poverty, and I will show also what the effect is on these children. So one of the things that we did in the survey is ask about the pathways of these children, so both gaps in missing school in Syria, but also again in Turkey or Lebanon, and you see that a lot of these children in this journey are missing a lot of school years, and that of course has a tremendous effect also on their school success now. Between half and 2/3 of the children miss 1 or more years of schooling. And you can imagine what it means to be 1 or 2 years out of school and then integrate back into school again. In Lebanon, 29% changed houses 4 times or more since they arrived, and on average they were 5 years in the country. So they are moving around all the time. So there's no stable situation, and that of course also affects where you can go to school and educate yourself. Imagine that you have to change 4 times the school where you are supposed to be learning. In Turkey it's a bit less, 90% change houses 4 times or more, but still substantial group that is in a very unsecure situation. And then we also asked if their families were struggling to make ends meet. So about half of the kids say their families are struggling to make ends meet in Lebanon, and more or less the same proportion of families struggles to meet ends in Turkey. And again, of course, this affects the education of the children, also partly because that means that the children also have to work next going to school. A socio-emotional time bomb. So we asked a lot of questions about what sort of emotions they have and in school and out of school. And I'm just giving a few examples, and these are sort of the normal questions that are asked in this sort of surveys. No, I'm going the wrong way. So I get a lot of headaches, stomach aches, or sicknesses. So this is true, as you can see. For about half of the children suffer what we usually call socio-psychological illnesses. So that's a substantial part of just the children that are in school. Informal, they are not in camps, they are in formal school, but in Lebanon in afternoon classes, and in Turkey now they are reintegrated into regular classes in Turkish school after they've been into temporary education centers. So when I get very angry, I lose my temper. I mean, this is of course something you would see play out also in an educational setting, and about half of the children say they have problems controlling their aggression. I'm often unhappy, depressed, or tearful. In Lebanon, it really is sky high, with 2/3 that are saying that they're actually quite depressed. So all these things are, of course, things that European countries were not deliberately pushing for when they were saying the region should do the job of incorporating these children in the situation in Lebanon and Turkey. But this is the reality of that choice. This is not what we see in the families that are now in Germany, Sweden, or Austria, or Switzerland. And this is the difference from those families that were able to come to Europe and those who were unable to come to Europe. Thank you.